All right, good afternoon. Today is March 25th. So the reading for today is 1 Samuel chapter 14. But we had skipped some of the other chapters from yesterday. So I went with chapters 12, 13, and 14 for today. So I included what they didn't include in the reading as part of discussion for today. So just to jump in it real quick, hopefully you guys are seeing it's like a Thanksgiving meal. So I had to stop early and I wasn't able to finish and I didn't want to rush through it. Like, somebody took the time to prepare something so amazing, but you don't have time, so you just kind of gobble it down and run. So I was like, Lord, grant me opportunity to really sit with your word and actually enjoy it. So chapter 12 is titled Samuel's Farewell Address. So in this, basically, Samuel is showing that his hands are clean. Like basically, he never did anything that could be held against him when it came to him ruling over Israel. He allowed them to sit down and to just recount the things that the Lord had done for them, which we can see is something that's so important in this entire season because most people always started and ended with all of the things that God did for them, starting with even bringing them out of Israel. And then it said that even though you already had God as a king, you still desired something different. And so basically, that's what's going to happen today. And so the thing is that even though he was saying that the God has granted your request, right? He said that now if you fear and worship the Lord and listen to his voice, and if you do not rebel against the Lord's commands, then both you and your king will show that you recognize the Lord as your God. But if you rebel against the Lord's commands and refuse to listen to him, then his hand will be heavy upon you as upon your ancestors. So being that Samuel was still like God's servant and he was actually following giving the people what they wanted, which is what God had decided to do. So he was just standing in a place as a representative of God. And he kind of concluded with the fact that even though he was no longer going to be a king or a person that was gonna seen as a judge over them now that they had a king, that he would still continue to be the person who prayed for them because that was who God had appointed him to be. So it wasn't like he was like, well, now you have your king, I get to step away and you guys are on your own. But instead he said, I'll continue to be who I am, who God appointed me to be. And and he said, but if you continue to sin, that was how he ended it, you're going to be swept away, right? So now, when we open up chapter 13, we see that it starts out by saying that Saul was 30 years old when he was king, and it said that he reigned for 42 years. And then it just kind of jumps into like when Saul actually was over his army and he was leading his army, and it was talking about him and Jonathan, his son. And it was saying how Saul had 3,000, but then Jonathan only had 1,000. But it was said that Jonathan had attacked and defeated part of the Philistines. And so for Saul, like even though he made sure that his army had the most, Jonathan was able to accomplish so much with a much smaller remnant. And at this, Saul went and he made a big blow with the ram's horn to now gather everybody and be like, okay, now we're gonna go and we're gonna fight, right? And so after he did that, it was like he made that big announcement, this is Saul. Now he finds himself scared because once the Philistines heard that he had did that, of course there was a response. It's one of those things like you get a victory over the enemy and it's almost like you don't even stop and pause to understand how it came about, but now you want to challenge something else And it's like the enemy is always gonna respond in a different way, right? So that's what's going on here. And so it was like after Saul had got himself in that position, he sent for Samuel, and Samuel told him to wait 7 days. So Saul waited the 7 days for Samuel, but Samuel didn't get there. And so Saul took it upon himself to now go and to burn a sacrifice unto the Lord. And so when Samuel arrives, Saul is like, "Oh, hey, great to see you. I was waiting for you. I did what you said, but you didn't get here in time." So I went ahead, and I took care of that. And it was one of those things where it was obvious that Saul was oblivious to what he had actually done. And it says, and it was one of those things where Samuel said, "How foolish, you have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you," right? So this lets me know that there had been some other discussion that had to take place. So even though Saul is looking at this instant and the action that he just committed at this time, you have to see that in the past, this was something that he knew better. So even though he tried to act like, well, since you didn't show up, it was okay for me to go ahead and get this done because I'm looking at my situation. Samuel is like, it's not okay because you have to follow God's commands, right? And so at this, Samuel said, "Now your kingdom must end," right? And he said that the Lord has sought someone after his own heart. And he said um, that person had already been appointed because you have not kept the Lord's command, right? And so it was now where we see that somebody else has already been chosen. But a lot of times, I guess we could see in passage that just because something is said today, it doesn't mean it's going to manifest today because there's still quite some time before this actually takes place. So now it's almost like Saul now has to think about the situation that he now finds himself in. And this is something else that was just really interesting to me in chapter 13, because after Samuel says this, they go to explain how much of a disadvantage Israel really was at. And this is because they talk about how they weren't allowed to have blacksmiths. So it kept them from actually having swords because if they had anything that needed to be sharpened, they would have to take it to the Philistines blacksmith, and they basically just allowed them to have tools that was necessary for them to be able to, like, take care of their cattle and stuff of that nature, like their farming equipment. But the only two people who had swords was Saul and Jonathan. And I think that that was just so proficient, the fact that they even mentioned it. But sometimes it's almost like, again, when you receive a victory, but you don't understand order or even understand how it happened, because remember, Saul didn't receive the victory, it was Jonathan. But as Saul's hearing Jonathan had that victory, he took it upon himself to move forward and in such a great way. And then when he found himself in trouble, he still didn't do things the way he knew to do them. He still chose to just continue moving forward. And I think that's why that big disadvantage was brought out, because Saul obviously didn't take into account other people, because even though he had a sword, the people that was with him, they did not. They had different things that they would use to help them fight, but they were without swords. And that's a big deal when you get ready to go to battle against the enemy, to actually look at how you're equipped, right? And so one of the things that goes now, and I think one of the things that really stood out to me in these next couple of chapters was the character, because now it shows Jonathan, and it said that Jonathan had slipped away from his father. Now, nothing in the Bible ever shows that Jonathan had any kind of a disrespect or a ill will toward his father, but it was one of those things where he followed a spirit that was different. Because I never see him doing anything disrespectful, but he was somebody who it just seems like he allowed something else to lead him, and that leading of him went beyond who his father was. And so it shows that when he went and he realized, that they were captured, he slipped away and he pretty much was sizing up the situation. And what he said to his armor bearer who was with him was, perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. So right there, it just speaks so much to the character of Jonathan, that Jonathan, even though it might have appeared that he was moving on his own accord, it was just that he was following after a different spirit. And he realized how they were not really prepared to actually have victory over the Philistines because they were ill equipped as far as to actually go out there and battle. But he knew that he served a God that would deliver people out of battles like there was nothing that God could not do. So he pretty much said, once they see us, if they respond this way, then we know God is not with us. But if they respond another way, then we know God is with us. And so when they revealed themselves and they said what they said that showed that God was with them, it was then that Jonathan advanced. And at that point, it was almost like God gave them the victory, but it wasn't like they sat up there and came up with some kind of strategic plan and they got all of their stuff together. No, he had to quiet himself and realize who the victory actually belonged to, and that if God was with them, that they would be able to go forward. And so in that instance, it was like that Israel had defeated the Philistines. And so it was one of those things again, Saul just got ahead of himself. And he was like, another thing, Saul was like, I want to have this full victory, and we're gonna not eat until we now have this great victory over all of the Philistines. So, unbeknownst to Jonathan, this was said, Jonathan is out there and he comes across honey. And so he takes the honey, and the person sees him and was like, "Oh my God, you went against your father," because Saul had went to the point to actually curse the person if they did that. And so it was like Jonathan was like, "But look at how refreshed I am after having that. Like, we're out here, we're in battle. Like, it's important that people are able to, satisfy and actually refresh themselves." It wasn't even like you see him sitting down having this whole feast, but it was like that little bit of refreshment, like a taste of honey, refreshed him so much. And he was like, that is just bad for, what my father has done to us. And it's crazy because now you can see that the rest of the people who are following Saul's orders, they're out there now and they overtake the Philistines and they begin to just kill a cattle and eat it just like that, like with blood and all, which was a great offense to God. And it was like somebody brought it to Saul's attention. And I think this is when Saul, and it says that he built an altar to the Lord. It was the first of altars he built to the Lord. So now this man has been a king, and we see earlier where he offered a sacrifice outside of what he was supposed to do, outside of Samuel's presence. And he hadn't even set up an altar. But it's almost like now what the people were doing, because he called them to do something that was so egregious, that now they're just responding and it's beyond, because they're not even hungry, they're beyond starving. So now he decides to build an altar and he offers a sacrifice, and then he says, you know now that they built the altar and that they could have the food now because it didn't have blood. And then it said that Saul said, "Let's chase the Philistines all night and plunder them all." And then his men replied, "We'll do whatever you think is best." Well, actually, it said, I know it said, yeah, let's, but the priest, that's the part that I highlighted. Because the people said, "We'll do whatever you think is best," but the priest said, "Let's ask God first." Right? So it's one of those things when sometimes people get put in a position and a position looks pleasing to somebody, and that person begins to do things that has an appearance of but it denies the relationship that you actually need to actually move forward and be victorious, that we have to be careful. Like, it's so easy sometimes to see people have things and to covet it and to want it. And it could just be an appearance of, but we should always look at the fruit behind it. Like, what spirit is actually moving them. Like, the fact that he would even think, after he just continuously puts them in very bad situations, but that, the people is like, okay, we'll do whatever you want. But then the priest was actually there to stop it. Like, no, we got to see what God wants, right? And so he said, then Saul actually stopped and asked God, all right, so one of the things was when God didn't respond to him that day, because we know that Saul is somebody who has an issue with patience, right? So when he said people didn't when God hadn't responded, well, Saul was like, well, why hasn't God responded? Like, what's the problem? And so he separated himself and Jonathan from the people and cast lots to see, well, where's this problem coming from? And so the way it fell was that, well, it wasn't the people, it's between you and Jonathan. So then he put it between him and Jonathan, and it was like, well, it was Jonathan. And that's when he became aware that Jonathan had broke his command about not eating anything until after they had plundered. And it was one of those things. He said, you know, that because he was guilty, Saul was ready to put Jonathan to death. And Jonathan admitted, he was like, that I did taste a little bit of honey, but does that deserve death? And Saul said, yes, that it did. And one of the things up until this point, that whenever Saul said something, and people's like response was, "Well, we'll do whatever you think is best." But thank you, Jesus. When it came to this, they actually was like, "No, no, 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 we're not," and they actually stood up for Jonathan, which is great because it was one of those things where, that wasn't anything that God required. It was something that Saul said. It wasn't a commandment from God or anything like that. It was something from Saul. So it was like they said that after that whole interaction happened, now Saul was able to actually go and have victory over the Philistines, right? And so from this point forward, it's almost like Saul began to build a great army for the people of Israel. And it said, so, whenever he observed a young man who was brave and strong, he drafted him into his army. And so the thing from today that really stood out to me, it's always going to go back to character and integrity. It's one of those things that when you choose to just understand and to walk in the way of God, there really is nothing better. It's almost like, but as we do life, we pick up things, we look at things and be like, oh, let me try this, let me try that, let me do this, let me do that. And it's like in doing it, like sometimes we might not even see how we're dishonoring God, but we always want to just know to go back, to repent, to turn back to his way and ask him to show us what it is that we should do, and even ask him to help us do it. Because in so many situations we know what's right and we still do what's wrong. But thank God, he sends his spirit. He sends us so many things to help. I even know of a spirit called the helper. So we have help. We have help in this walking in this life. So this was some good scripture. So I'm praying that you guys are taking time and sitting with this like a meal that was just so much preparation went into it, and that there's a spirit like designed to actually meet you here. So be blessed, and I will see you tomorrow.